The small town of Ashwood had always been known for its quiet charm. Nestled between towering pines and rolling hills, it was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and where each day passed like the one before it. But tonight, things were different. Tonight, the town buzzed with an unsettling energy. The reason? The rare blood moon that would grace the sky later that evening. For weeks, the townspeople had been preparing for the event. Excitement filled the air as local shops sold decorations, and people discussed what the red moon might mean. Most assumed it was simply a strange celestial occurrence, a once-in-a-lifetime event that would make for a good story and a beautiful photo opportunity. But for a few, the blood moon symbolized something far darker. Among them was Sarah, a young woman in her early 20s, who had recently returned to Ashwood after years of living in the city. She had grown up here, and despite the town's idyllic reputation, she'd always felt there was something off about it, something that didn't sit right in the deepest corners of her mind. And as the moon loomed closer, that feeling only intensified. Sarah had no particular interest in the blood moon itself, but her grandmother had spoken of it often when she was a child, always with a sense of dread and caution in her voice. When the blood moon rises, the town will be tested, her grandmother would say, the words laced with fear. But young Sarah had brushed off her warnings as the superstitions of an old woman. After all, the blood moon was just a natural phenomenon, wasn't it? Now, standing in the doorway of her grandmother's old cottage, the memories rushed back. The house was just as she remembered, dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of old books and herbs. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, remnants of a time long forgotten. Her grandmother had been a healer, someone who knew things about the world that Sarah couldn't quite understand. Now, her grandmother was gone, leaving Sarah with a tangle of unanswered questions. As the evening sky darkened and the first hints of the blood moon began to appear, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient was stirring. She grabbed her grandmother's journal from the shelf, hoping to find something that might explain the strange sensations creeping under her skin. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and sketches of rituals, many of which referenced the blood moon. One passage stood out. When the blood moon rises, the ritual will begin. The town will fall, and the ancient evil will awaken. It must be stopped before the final hour. The words sent a chill down her spine. The ritual, the evil, could it be real? At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Startled, Sarah quickly closed the journal and hid it beneath the floorboards, just as her neighbor, Mr. Clayton, stepped inside. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with concern. "Sarah," he said in a hushed voice, "have you heard? The elders are preparing for the ritual tonight. They're gathering at the old church." He paused, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if ensuring no one was listening. "Something's wrong, Sarah. I think your grandmother's warnings were more than just stories." Sarah felt her heart race. The elders, the ritual. She had heard whispers about them in passing over the years, older residents who seemed to hold more sway in Ashwood than the town's elected officials. But she never imagined their influence extended to something as sinister as a ritual. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "What ritual?" "The one they perform every century when the blood moon rises," Mr. Clayton replied, his voice trembling. "They say it keeps the town safe, keeps the evil locked away. But there's always a price. No one knows what happens if the ritual fails." Sarah's mind raced, her grandmother's words echoing in her head. Could it be true? Was there truly an ancient evil buried beneath Ashwood, waiting to be unleashed? Before she could speak, there was a loud bang from outside, followed by the sound of footsteps. Mr. Clayton's face drained of color, and he grabbed Sarah's wrist. "Get inside," he hissed, pulling her toward the back door. "They're coming. Confused and terrified, Sarah followed him, her heart pounding. They slipped out into the darkness of the woods behind the cottage, keeping low and silent. The air was thick with tension as they made their way through the trees, the distant sound of chanting reaching Sarah's ears. It was as if the town had come alive, consumed by something dark and ritualistic. They stopped at the edge of the forest, where the old church loomed ahead. The building was bathed in the eerie glow of the blood moon, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. Figures moved around it, cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden. The chanting grew louder, and Sarah could feel the air itself vibrating with a strange energy. "What is happening?" Sarah breathed, her voice shaking. "This is the ritual," Mr. Clayton whispered. "It's starting. We have to stop them." Sarah felt a pull toward the church, an inexplicable compulsion to go inside. But as she took a step forward, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. It was an old woman, her face hidden beneath a hood, but Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze. The woman raised a bony hand and whispered words that made the air freeze. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," the woman said, her voice a low rasp. "The ritual cannot be stopped. You are part of it now." Before Sarah could respond, the woman raised her hand higher, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet began to tremble. The blood moon hung low in the sky, casting a sinister glow over everything. A low rumble echoed through the earth, as if something deep beneath Ashwood was awakening. With a final, shuddering breath, Sarah turned to run. But the woman's hand shot out, grasping her wrist. A cold, suffocating darkness began to fill the air, as if the very world around her was falling apart. "Run, Sarah!" Mr. Clayton shouted, pulling her away. But the woman's grip was unrelenting, and Sarah could feel her body weakening, the darkness closing in. And then, as the clock in the town square struck midnight, the sky above Ashwood turned a deep, blood red, and the earth seemed to quake beneath her. The ritual had begun. The ground trembled beneath Sarah's feet as she struggled to free herself from the old woman's iron grip. The figure before her muttered something in a language Sarah didn't recognize, a chant that sent chills down her spine. The blood moon hung high above, casting an eerie red glow that bathed the entire town in a sinister light. The air was thick with tension, as if every breath she took was tainted with the smell of impending doom. "Let go of me," Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the low hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Her pulse raced, heart pounding in her chest, as her body felt heavier, the darkness around her growing more suffocating with each passing second. The old woman's grip tightened, and Sarah could feel her strength waning. She struggled against the unseen force pressing down on her, but it was as if her body no longer belonged to her. The world around her was spinning, her vision blurring as the shadows of the forest seemed to close in. "Run!" Mr. Clayton's voice broke through the haze, his hand gripping Sarah's wrist with enough force to pull her free. With a desperate gasp, she stumbled backward, wrenching herself away from the woman's grasp. The moment she broke free, the world seemed to shudder. The blood moon above glowed brighter, its crimson light intensifying as if it were alive. And then the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah gasped for breath, her body trembling. Her legs felt like jelly beneath her, but she forced herself to stand. Mr. Clayton was already pulling her toward the edge of the forest, away from the church and its unsettling congregation. He didn't speak, but his face was grim, filled with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. "What's happening?" she whispered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What was that woman? What are they doing?" Mr. Clayton didn't answer immediately. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. "They're performing the ritual," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "And it's too late to stop them." Sarah's heart sank as she processed his words. Too late to stop them. What did that mean? Was the town already doomed? She could still feel the oppressive weight of the woman's touch on her wrist, and the terrifying energy that had pulsed through the air. Whatever the ritual was, it was far more powerful than anything Sarah had ever imagined. "Mr. Clayton, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "What's going to happen? What's so dangerous about this blood moon?" The older man paused and turned to face her, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time, Sarah saw the full extent of the terror that gripped him. "It's not the moon itself," he explained, his voice shaking. "It's what's hidden beneath it. The ritual they perform isn't just to honor the moon. It's to keep something locked away, something ancient, something evil." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What kind of evil?" Mr. Clayton didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him as they continued their trek through the woods. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer, and the eerie hum from the church grew louder, vibrating through the ground like a living thing. Suddenly, a noise cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate from deep within the earth. It was the sound of something waking, something that had been buried for centuries. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. Her pulse spiked, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel it now, the ground beneath her feet pulsing with the rhythm of something alive, something ancient and monstrous. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Mr. Clayton," she whispered, "what is that?" He didn't answer. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with panic. He motioned for Sarah to stay quiet, then began moving even faster, pushing through the dense trees. They emerged from the forest and found themselves standing at the edge of the town. The church was still visible in the distance, but the scene had changed. A thick, swirling mist had begun to roll in, covering the streets like a suffocating blanket. The distant sound of chanting had stopped, but there was an overwhelming sense of dread in the air, as though something terrible was about to unfold. "We need to get to the town hall," Mr. Clayton said urgently. "It's the only place that might be safe." "The town hall?" Sarah asked, confusion clouding her thoughts. "Why?" "Because the town has a defense," he explained, his voice urgent. "A safeguard that was put in place centuries ago. But the ritual has to be stopped first. We have to act before it's too late." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through Sarah's body. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she didn't have time to question him. Something dark was spreading through the town, and she needed to understand what it was before it consumed them all. They hurried through the mist-covered streets, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the fog. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The blood moon, the ritual, the ancient evil Mr. Clayton had mentioned. But nothing seemed to add up. As they reached the town hall, Sarah glanced back toward the church. The blood moon had reached its apex, and the red glow seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The mist was thicker now, and Sarah could swear she saw shapes moving within it. Figures that didn't belong. "We have to go inside," Mr. Clayton urged, his voice low. The heavy wooden doors of the town hall creaked open as they stepped inside, and Sarah immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. It was cooler here, the air heavier with the scent of old wood and damp stone. There were no lights, only the flickering glow of candles scattered around the large room. The town hall had an ancient, almost sacred feel to it, and Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that she was stepping into something far larger than herself. Mr. Clayton moved quickly toward a staircase at the back of the hall. his steps echoing in the silence. He didn't look back to see if Sarah was following, but she was right behind him, her heart racing in her chest. At the top of the stairs, they entered a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with strange symbols, most of which Sarah couldn't recognize, but they seemed familiar, as though they were tied to something ancient. "Stay here," Mr. Clayton said, turning to face her. "I need to get something." Before Sarah could ask what he was doing, he disappeared into a side room, leaving her alone in the dark. The silence was unbearable. Suddenly, the air seemed to grow colder, and Sarah could hear something. A faint whisper, like a distant voice calling her name. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a presence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped even further. She could see her breath misting in front of her, and the shadows around her seemed to grow darker, more menacing. The air was thick with the scent of decay. And then, in the corner of the room, she saw it. A dark figure, half hidden in shadow, standing motionless. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The figure in the corner of the room stared at Sarah, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The air in the room was thick, colder than it had ever been, and the dark presence seemed to press in on her from every direction. The figure took another step forward, its form growing clearer with each movement. It wasn't human, Sarah could tell that much. Its features were blurred, almost as if they didn't belong in this world. The shadows seemed to swirl around it like a cloak, adding to the unnerving sense that she was facing something far older and far more dangerous than anything she could imagine. Her pulse raced as the figure's eyes locked onto hers, the intensity of its gaze freezing her in place. The whispering voices from earlier had returned, louder this time, as though the very air was alive with dark energy. Suddenly, the figure's mouth moved, but no sound came. It was as if it was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't form. Sarah's throat tightened, her breath catching as the figure began to walk toward her. The room seemed to grow darker with every step it took, the shadows deepening as if they were alive, feeding off the presence of this creature. In a desperate attempt to break free from her paralysis, Sarah forced her legs to move. She backed away slowly, her feet stumbling on the cold floor, her hands shaking. But as she took a step, the figure stopped. It tilted its head slightly, as if intrigued by her movement. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Sarah could see her breath misting in the air. The darkness seemed to stretch out before her, swallowing up the corners of the room. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space for an escape, but there was none. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices chanting words she didn't understand. It was as if the very walls of the room were alive, breathing with the dark energy that pulsed through the air. Her head throbbed, and the room seemed to spin, the shadows pressing in closer. "Sarah," the voice was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. It was Mr. Clayton's voice. She whipped around, desperate for any sign of safety. Mr. Clayton stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. His breath was shallow, and he was sweating, his hands trembling as he held a small, weathered book. "Get away from it," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "It's not real. It's a manifestation." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of strength she had left, she ran toward him, her feet slipping on the slick floor. The figure didn't follow. Its glowing eyes remained locked on her, but it didn't move. Instead, the shadows around it seemed to pulse and writhe, as if they were alive, their twisted shapes stretching toward her like tendrils. She reached Mr. Clayton, who immediately grabbed her by the arm and pulled her into the hallway. The moment they stepped out of the room, the door slammed shut behind them, the loud bang echoing through the building. "Are you all right?" Mr. Clayton asked, his voice shaking. I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What was that? What did it want?" Mr. Clayton looked at her with a mixture of pity and regret. "It wasn't real. Not in the way we think of reality. That thing was a manifestation of the ritual, a part of the dark energy that's been awakened by the blood moon. It's a warning, but not one we can ignore." Sarah's head was spinning. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was no use. The darkness from the room still clung to her. The cold air around her seemed to press in, making it hard to think clearly. "What is the ritual? What are they trying to do?" she asked, her voice desperate. Mr. Clayton looked around nervously before pulling her toward a nearby staircase. They ascended quickly, the heavy sound of their footsteps reverberating off the stone walls. He didn't speak until they reached the top of the stairs and entered a small, dimly lit room. "It's an ancient ritual," he explained, setting the old book down on a table. "It's been practiced for centuries, passed down through generations of people who have sworn to protect the town from the darkness. The ritual is meant to keep something locked away, buried deep beneath the earth." "But what's locked away?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Clayton paused, looking as though he was trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and grim. "A creature, an ancient evil, older than the town itself. Something that feeds on fear, on suffering. It's said to have been sealed away long ago by a group of powerful individuals who knew the dangers it posed. But now the blood moon has awakened it." Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't understand everything, but she could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. Whatever this creature was, it was powerful, too powerful to be contained for long. And with each passing moment, it was drawing closer. "What happens if the ritual succeeds?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. "If they complete the ritual," Mr. Clayton said softly, "they'll be able to control the creature, keep it bound in the shadows. But if they fail..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If they failed, the creature would be unleashed, and no one in the town would be safe. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The town was on the brink of disaster, and it was up to her and Mr. Clayton to stop it. "But we can stop it, right?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to," Mr. Clayton said, his face grim. "The ritual is happening right now. We have to find a way to interrupt it before it's too late. The book has a way to break the connection." He opened the old book and began scanning the pages. The pages were filled with strange symbols and writing that Sarah couldn't understand, but she could see the urgency in Mr. Clayton's movements. Time was running out. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the floor below, followed by a scream. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Mr. Clayton, fear in her eyes. Without a word, he grabbed the book, and they rushed toward the stairs. The scream echoed again, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of frantic footsteps, heavy and fast. The town was already feeling the effects of the ritual, and it was only a matter of time before the full force of the ancient evil was unleashed. As they descended the stairs, Sarah could hear the distant chanting from the church again, but it was different this time. More urgent, more desperate. The ritual was nearing its climax, and the air was thick with the promise of something terrible. They burst out of the town hall and into the streets, and Sarah gasped as she saw the town in chaos. People were running, screaming, but there was nowhere to hide. The mist had grown thicker, and the red light from the blood moon seemed to shine through it like an ominous beacon. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, panic rising in her chest. "We have to stop them," Mr. Clayton said, determination in his voice. "Before it's too late." The town square was in chaos. People ran in every direction, their faces pale with terror, as if they knew something unspeakable was about to unfold. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she and Mr. Clayton pushed their way through the crowd, desperate to reach the church. The air was thick with tension, the crimson light of the blood moon casting an eerie glow over everything. It felt as if time itself was slowing down, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with each step, the earth groaning as though it too was aware of the impending doom. The chanting from the church grew louder, more frantic. It was clear now that the ritual was nearing its final moments. "Stay close," Mr. Clayton muttered, his voice tight with fear. He gripped the old book tightly in his hands, as though it were their only hope. Sarah nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. As they approached the church, Sarah could see that the doors were wide open. Inside, shadows danced erratically, casting long, twisted shapes across the walls. The chanting was almost deafening now, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from all directions. "Where are they?" Sarah whispered urgently. "Where's the ritual happening?" Mr. Clayton didn't answer immediately. His face was grim as he surveyed the scene, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "There," he said, pointing to the altar at the far end of the church. "That's where they're performing the ritual." Sarah's gaze followed his finger. At the altar, a group of figures stood in a tight circle, their arms raised toward the ceiling, their faces hidden in the shadows. The air around them seemed to shimmer, vibrating with an unnatural energy. "I don't see anyone we know," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Who are they?" "They're the town's elders," Mr. Clayton replied. "They've been preparing for this moment for years. It's always been part of their tradition. Only they didn't know what they were truly awakening." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, confusion clouding her thoughts. "The ritual wasn't just meant to keep the creature sealed away," Mr. Clayton said. "It was meant to bind it to the blood moon to make sure it never rose again. But something went wrong. I don't know how, but somehow the creature's power has grown stronger. The blood moon is no longer just a celestial event. It's the key to releasing something far worse." As the last of his words fell into the heavy silence, the chanting from the altar reached a crescendo. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The very air around her felt charged, alive with dark energy. "Now!" Mr. Clayton urged, pulling Sarah forward. They hurried to the altar, but as they approached, something terrifying happened. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and stretch, forming into dark, almost human shapes. Figures moved in the corners of the church, their eyes glowing faintly, locked on Sarah and Mr. Clayton. "They're not human," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What are they?" "They're manifestations of the creature's influence," Mr. Clayton said, his voice tight with fear. "They're not real, not in the way we understand, but they're dangerous." The shadows lunged, and Sarah screamed, instinctively backing away. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding them, closing in with terrifying speed. Sarah's heart raced as she backed into Mr. Clayton, who was clutching the book tightly. "We have to fight them off," he said, his voice strained. "The ritual, it has to be stopped." With no other choice, Sarah and Mr. Clayton both grabbed whatever they could, pieces of broken wood, fragments of stone, and began to fight off the advancing shadows. But they were everywhere, and each blow seemed to do little to deter them. The darkness was closing in, pushing them back toward the altar. "What's happening?" Sarah gasped, swinging the piece of wood at a shadowy figure that lunged at her. "Why can't we stop them? The ritual is weakening the boundary between our world and the creatures," Mr. Clayton said, his face grim. "We have to destroy the altar, destroy the source of their power." But before they could act, a terrible screech filled the air, so loud it felt as if it were coming from inside their skulls. The shadows halted in their tracks, and for a moment, everything was still. The creatures stared at them with eyes that seemed to burn with unholy fire, their movements frozen. Then, the ground beneath them cracked open, a deafening sound like thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The altar began to glow with an eerie red light, pulsating as if alive, and the chanting from the town's elders grew louder, more insistent. "What's happening?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide in horror. "What is that light?" "It's the creature," Mr. Clayton shouted. "It's breaking through. The ritual is almost complete." The air seemed to vibrate with dark energy, and Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. She looked up and saw the shadows begin to dissolve, swept away by the intensity of the ritual. But they were replaced by something far worse. The walls of the church began to pulse with the same red light, and a shadow, vast and menacing, began to emerge from the altar. It was like a living, breathing entity, its form too large and twisted to comprehend. Its eyes were burning pools of crimson, and its presence filled the church with an oppressive, suffocating weight. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they were facing. The creature was real. The ancient evil that had been sealed away for centuries was awakening. "We have to stop it," Sarah cried, panic rising in her chest. "We can't let it escape." Mr. Clayton nodded grimly, but his eyes were filled with despair. "It's too late. The ritual is complete. The creature is free." The ground shook violently as the creature's form began to take shape, filling the entire church with its monstrous presence. Its eyes locked onto Sarah and Mr. Clayton, and in that moment, Sarah felt a deep, terrifying pull toward it. The creature's gaze was hypnotic, and she could feel her will slipping away as it drew closer. The town was lost. The world was lost, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The creature loomed over Sarah and Mr. Clayton, its massive form blocking out the flickering red light of the blood moon. Its eyes, glowing with an unholy fire, bore into their souls as if it could see their deepest fears. The air around them grew colder, and the church seemed to close in, its ancient stone walls pressing in on them, suffocating them with the weight of centuries of darkness. "Stay close," Mr. Clayton hissed, his voice barely audible over the creature's low, guttural growl. His grip on the ancient book tightened, knuckles turning white. But Sarah could feel his desperation, his growing fear. The power of the creature was overwhelming, and even the pages of the book, which had once held hope, seemed to tremble in Mr. Clayton's hands. The creature's form continued to shift, its body growing more solid, more terrifying, as the ritual's energy surged. The ground beneath their feet groaned, the earth itself shaking as if it too were rebelling against the release of the ancient evil. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a foul stench that clung to every breath they took. "We need to do something," Sarah shouted, panic flooding her voice. But her words were drowned out by the booming voice of the creature, which seemed to echo through the very air, vibrating the bones in their bodies. "You cannot stop me," the creature's voice rumbled, as if it came from deep within the earth itself. "This town, this world is mine. The blood moon is my gate. And now I am free." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and her knees felt weak beneath her. But she could not allow herself to give in to the terror. She had to act. She had to stop this. "What do we do, Mr. Clayton?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced at him. Mr. Clayton's face was pale, his lips pressed tight, but there was something in his eyes, something that burned with the remnants of hope. He turned his gaze to the altar, still glowing with the red light, and then back to the creature. "There's only one way," Mr. Clayton said, his voice strained. "We have to destroy the altar. The ritual may have failed, but the altar is still a conduit to the creature's power. If we destroy it, we can weaken it, maybe even banish it back." "But how?" Sarah asked, feeling the weight of his words. Destroying the altar seemed impossible. The church was shaking as the creature grew stronger with each passing second. Mr. Clayton glanced down at the book, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the ancient pages. "There's a ritual, a reverse ritual. It's dangerous, but it might work. We need to perform it before the creature fully materializes." Sarah's eyes widened. "A reverse ritual? How?" "We need to gather the components," he said urgently. "There's no time to waste." He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back of the church where the sacred relics were stored. The creature's form began to ripple, a mass of darkness swirling in the air, its tendrils reaching toward them. Its eyes never left them, and Sarah could feel its malevolent gaze boring into her, sensing her every move. As they ran toward the relics, Sarah could hear the creature's voice again, low and menacing. "You think you can banish me? I am eternal. The blood moon is my time. You are nothing." But despite the fear that gnawed at her, Sarah refused to turn back. She had to believe that they could stop it. They had to. The back of the church was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old incense and burnt candles. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange, ancient artifacts. Mr. Clayton moved quickly, his hands shaking as he scanned the shelves. "We need silver," he said urgently. "Silver is the key. There's an ancient dagger here. Bring it to me." Sarah's eyes darted across the shelves, searching frantically. Her breath was coming in short bursts, and the creature's growls filled the air, making it impossible to concentrate. But then, she saw it. A dagger with a silver blade, glinting ominously in the dim light. She grabbed it and handed it to Mr. Clayton, her hands trembling. He took the dagger, inspecting it with a sigh of relief. "This is it. We can use this to channel the reverse ritual." The ground beneath them trembled again, the walls of the church shaking violently. Sarah could hear the creature's growls growing louder, its form now fully visible in the center of the church, towering over them. "It's coming," Sarah whispered. "We have to hurry." Mr. Clayton nodded, his face grim. He turned back to the altar, the book still open in his hands. He began to chant softly under his breath, the words foreign and ancient, their meaning lost to time. The silver dagger glowed with an eerie light as he raised it above the altar. The creature roared in fury, its form beginning to crackle and writhe with dark energy. The red light from the blood moon flickered and intensified, as though the entire church was being consumed by the power of the ritual. "Now!" Mr. Clayton shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "We must complete it now." But before they could act, the church doors slammed shut, the sound echoing through the air like thunder. The creature's eyes blazed with rage as it began to move toward them, its massive form shaking the very foundation of the church. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the creature was more powerful than they had imagined. The ritual may have been their only hope, but it was slipping from their grasp. "Mr. Clayton, we're running out of time," Sarah cried, her voice filled with fear. With no other choice, Mr. Clayton grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the altar. The dagger in his hand pulsed with power, but as they neared the altar, something impossible happened. The altar began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it was blinding. The entire church seemed to be filled with the light, and then, The ground split open with a deafening crack, and from the depths of the earth, something began to rise. The earth trembled beneath Sarah's feet as the creature began to rise from the fissure in the ground. Its body was a mass of darkness, ever shifting and writhing like smoke, but with an unmistakable shape. It was tall, far taller than any man, with elongated limbs and a face that was more nightmare than reality. Eyes glowing with an infernal red light locked onto Sarah and Mr. Clayton, their intensity enough to paralyze anyone with fear. This can't be real," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The ground beneath her seemed to shift and buckle as though the earth itself was giving way to the monstrous being emerging from its depths. She felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine, and her breath became shallow as panic set in. Mr. Clayton stood frozen for a moment, staring at the creature with a mixture of disbelief and terror. The book in his hands quivered as though it could sense the impending doom. But then, snapping out of his trance, he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the altar. "We can't let it complete the ritual," he shouted over the growing roar of the creature. "If we don't stop it, this town will be lost forever." Sarah's heart raced, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. The creature's presence was suffocating, its very existence pulling at the fabric of reality. The blood moon outside the church seemed to intensify, casting an ominous red glow across everything. The ritual had gone wrong, and now the town was caught in the grip of a nightmare that was coming to life. "What do we do?" she cried, looking at the altar where the silver dagger still pulsed with a faint light. She could see that Mr. Clayton was shaking now, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We finished the ritual," he said with a trembling voice. "We have no choice. We reverse it. It's the only way." Before Sarah could speak, the creature howled in rage. The sound seemed to come from every corner of the church, reverberating through the walls, vibrating the very air around them. The stone floor cracked under the creature's weight as it took its first steps toward them, its massive form moving slowly but inexorably forward. Mr. Clayton's hands shook as he gripped the silver dagger tighter. "Sarah, I need you to trust me. You must keep the creature occupied. I'll perform the final step of the ritual." Sarah nodded, though a chill ran down her spine. Her mind raced with thoughts of what to do. The creature was too powerful, too monstrous. But if she didn't help, it would be too late. "I'll try," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. With no time to waste, she dashed toward the creature, feeling the heat radiating from its form as it loomed before her. The creature's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, it paused, as if contemplating her. Then, in a flash of movement, its large clawed hand shot forward, swiping at her with terrifying speed. Sarah ducked just in time, the wind from its claws brushing her hair as she fell to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature's eyes flickered with something almost like amusement, as if it were enjoying her terror. But Sarah wasn't about to give up. She lunged at the creature, grabbing an old candle from the altar and tossing it toward the beast. The candle ignited in a burst of flame, momentarily blinding the creature. For just a second, it staggered back, its movements erratic. "Mr. Clayton, hurry!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. The creature roared again, its form shifting violently in the light. It was coming for her, and there was no escape. At the altar, Mr. Clayton began to chant again, his voice growing louder with each passing second. The book in his hands began to glow with a strange, ethereal light, and the silver dagger pulsed in rhythm with his words. The church around them seemed to darken, the air thickening with the energy of the ritual. Sarah turned her attention back to the creature. It had stopped moving for a moment, its focus now entirely on Mr. Clayton. This was her chance. She grabbed a broken piece of wood from the nearby wreckage and raised it above her head, preparing to strike. But before she could act, the creature turned toward her again, its red eyes glowing brighter with rage. It let out a deafening scream, the sound rattling her very bones. "I'm not afraid of you," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with defiance. She swung the wooden stake at the creature's leg, but it barely seemed to notice. The stake shattered against its hardened skin, sending splinters flying in every direction. In a flash, the creature moved toward her, its claws raised to strike. But before it could make contact, a bright light erupted from the altar, blinding them all. Mr. Clayton had completed the ritual. The creature screamed in agony, its form writhing violently as though it was being pulled apart. The ground beneath them cracked open wider, and the church shook with a force that threatened to collapse it entirely. The red glow of the blood moon grew blinding, and for a moment, everything seemed to spin. "Now!" Mr. Clayton shouted, his voice hoarse from the effort. "Help me! We have to force it back." Sarah felt her pulse racing as she rushed toward the altar, but just as she reached Mr. Clayton, the ground shook again, even harder than before. The ceiling above them cracked, dust and debris falling from the rafters. And then, a voice, a whisper, slithered through the air, so faint at first that Sarah thought she had imagined it. But it grew louder, clearer. It was a voice full of malice, full of ancient evil. "Foolish mortals," the voice hissed, sending a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. "You cannot banish me. You are too weak. The blood moon is my dominion. Nothing will stop me." The air grew colder, and a violent gust of wind blasted through the church. The creature's form shifted, growing larger, its eyes now gleaming with an even more terrifying light. Sarah's heart stopped. The creature was no longer merely a threat. It was becoming something far worse, something unstoppable. "Mr. Clayton," she cried out, but he was already moving, chanting faster, his voice frantic as the light from the dagger flickered and dimmed. But the creature was getting stronger. The ritual was failing. When Sarah's vision returned, the world around her was a blur of shadows. Her head throbbed as though she had been struck by a force far beyond human understanding. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the dizziness from her mind. The air felt dense, thick with the oppressive presence of something ancient and evil. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as though weighed down by an invisible force. Panic surged in her chest as she realized that she was no longer in the church. Instead, she was surrounded by a dark, ethereal void. The ground beneath her feet was shifting, unstable, as if it was constantly in motion. "Mr. Clayton?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the void. But there was no response. Her heart beat faster, anxiety rising within her. Then, out of the darkness, she heard a low, rumbling laugh, cold and menacing. She spun around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. "Did you really think you could stop me, little girl?" The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. It sent a shiver through Sarah's spine. She felt the presence of something enormous, looming just beyond her reach, its very essence pressing against her mind. She turned in the direction of the voice. The darkness seemed to ripple and distort, as if the air itself was alive. Slowly, a figure began to take shape, tall, looming, with a presence that seemed to bend reality around it. The creature, the very thing they had tried to banish. The creature's glowing red eyes locked onto Sarah's, and in that instant, a wave of terror washed over her. It was the same creature that had risen from the earth during the ritual, but it was no longer bound by the physical world. It was pure, unadulterated evil, untethered and unstoppable. "Where is Mr. Clayton?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaky but determined. She forced herself to stand tall, though her knees felt weak. She couldn't let fear control her now. The creature's laugh echoed again, but this time it carried a touch of amusement. "Mr. Clayton?" it sneered. "You think he can save you? He is a mere pawn, a fool who thought he could control forces far greater than he could comprehend." Sarah's heart sank. "No, he was trying to help me." "Help?" The creature's laugh twisted into a mocking hiss. "He was nothing more than a sacrifice. And now so are you." Before Sarah could respond, the world around her began to change. The void around her started to break apart, the air crackling with dark energy. She found herself back in the church, but it was no longer the sanctuary she had once known. The walls were crumbling, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. The red glow of the blood moon bathed everything in an eerie, crimson light. The altar had disappeared, replaced by an enormous, blackened pit in the center of the church. From the pit rose tendrils of darkness, coiling and slithering like serpents. The creature loomed above it, its eyes gleaming with an evil hunger. "What is this?" Sarah gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. "The end," the creature growled. "The ritual is complete. The blood moon has unlocked the gateway to my domain. And now this town, your world, belongs to me." A scream caught in Sarah's throat as the creature's form expanded, its limbs twisting and growing, stretching impossibly long. She could hear the sound of bones cracking, and for a moment, she thought the creature might tear the very fabric of reality apart. But just as quickly as the transformation began, it stopped. The creature was now fully formed, its monstrous body hovering above the pit. Its face was nothing but a twisted mockery of a human, with sharp, jagged features and glowing eyes that burned with malice. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to stop this. She had to find a way to banish the creature once and for all. But how? Suddenly, she remembered the silver dagger, the same dagger that Mr. Clayton had used during the ritual, the one that had pulsed with strange, otherworldly energy. She turned toward the altar, hoping against hope that it might still be there. To her relief, the dagger lay at the foot of the pit, glowing faintly with a cold, silvery light. She ran toward it, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind focused on the task at hand. If she could just get to the dagger, she might have a chance to stop this. But before she could reach it, the creature's massive hand shot forward, its claws raking the air like deadly weapons. Sarah screamed as she ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the strike. The ground trembled beneath her, and the very church seemed to shift in response to the creature's movements. "You think you can stop me?" the creature snarled. "You are nothing. I am eternal." But Sarah didn't listen. She reached the altar and grabbed the dagger, feeling its cold weight in her hands. The moment her fingers closed around the hilt, a surge of energy coursed through her, and the world around her seemed to snap into focus. She could feel the power of the dagger, ancient and powerful, coursing through her veins. The creature roared in fury, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She held the dagger high, her eyes locked onto the creature as she prepared for the final strike. With all her strength, Sarah lunged forward, aiming the dagger at the creature's heart. But just as she was about to strike, the creature's massive hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist and stopping her in her tracks. "You think this will stop me?" it hissed, its breath hot and foul against her skin. "You are too weak to defeat me." Sarah's vision blurred with fear as she struggled to free herself. The creature's grip tightened, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness from the pain. But then, something deep within her stirred. The power of the dagger was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was an ancient force meant to break the very bonds of evil that had been forged over millennia. With a burst of strength, Sarah twisted the dagger in her hand, slashing across the creature's clawed fingers. It howled in pain, its grip loosening just enough for Sarah to break free. Before the creature could react, she plunged the dagger into its heart. The creature's scream echoed through the church, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air grew still, and the ground beneath them stopped shaking. Sarah held her breath, watching as the creature writhed in agony, its form convulsing violently. But it wasn't over yet. The creature's eyes burned brighter than ever, and in that instant, Sarah knew that she hadn't destroyed it. Not completely. The blood moon was still high in the sky, and its power was far from spent. Sarah's pulse raced as the creature's voice echoed around her. The mist that once had taken form began to swirl, gathering force, spinning like a deadly tornado. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could feel its presence, like a cold hand gripping her heart, squeezing the very life from her. She gripped the dagger tighter, ready for whatever might come next. You have only delayed the inevitable. You cannot defeat me. I will rise again. The words were imprinted on her mind, chilling her to the core. No, she thought, shaking her head violently. She couldn't let it win. She had to stop it. The air grew colder, darker, as if the very atmosphere was bending to the will of the creature. The church around her seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its sinister power. The walls began to crack, and the stained glass windows shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air, glittering like deadly diamonds in the blood-red light. Then, something worse happened. The ground beneath her feet trembled once more, but this time it wasn't just an earthquake. It felt like the very earth itself was being torn apart, as if the boundaries between worlds were breaking. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Sarah felt a pressure on her chest, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her. "No!" she shouted, gritting her teeth, refusing to succumb to fear. She could feel the power of the dagger still surging through her, though it was weakening. If I can just hold on. But then, with a deafening roar, the ground in front of her split open, and out from the rift emerged a shadow darker than the night itself. It was more massive than she could have ever imagined, a form that seemed to defy the laws of nature, impossibly large and writhing. The mist surrounded it, swirling like a storm, feeding into its monstrous shape. The blood moon, still hanging high in the sky, cast its crimson glow on the creature, making its form glow with an otherworldly fire. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, burning with malice and hunger. It was no longer just a beast. It was the embodiment of an ancient evil, an entity that had existed long before time itself. And it was back. "You should have listened," the creature's voice boomed, resonating with a power that shook the very foundation of the church. "I warned you that you could never defeat me." Sarah's mind was racing. She was running out of time, literally. The very air around her was thick with the oppressive force of the creature's power. Her hands trembled, but she refused to back down. She could see the dagger's glow beginning to fade, and in that instant, she knew what she had to do. The creature might have returned, but she still had one final chance to stop it. One last desperate move. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're wrong," she said, her voice filled with determination, though it wavered slightly with fear. "You may have risen once, but you won't rise again." The creature hissed, the sound like nails scraping across a chalkboard. "I will destroy you, just as I destroyed the others." The shadows around Sarah seemed to close in, but she pushed forward, gripping the dagger with all the strength left in her. She couldn't let it win. She wouldn't let it. Her entire being screamed for survival. As she reached the altar, she raised the dagger high, The ground rumbled beneath her, the air electric with dark energy. She could feel the ancient power of the dagger thrumming against her skin, urging her on. "You will not take this world," she whispered, her voice steady and filled with resolve. With every ounce of strength she had left, she drove the dagger into the heart of the rift that had opened up beneath her. The very fabric of reality seemed to shudder, and for a brief moment, everything went completely still. Time itself seemed to halt as if the universe was holding its breath. Then, with an explosive force that sent Sarah flying backward, the world shattered. When Sarah opened her eyes, the world around her was eerily quiet. The church was still standing, though the once crimson glow of the blood moon had faded, leaving behind a pale, sickly light. The rift had closed, the air no longer thick with the oppressive darkness that had consumed it. She slowly stood, shaking, her legs unsteady as though they were no longer fully part of her. The dagger, once shining brightly with power, now lay cold and dull in her hand. She looked around, but the creature was gone. Had she truly won? Or was this just another trick? Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she took a step forward, cautiously. She scanned the room, her eyes wide, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the creature's return. But the silence was deafening. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. The weight of the situation was lifting, the overwhelming sense of dread slowly fading. However, as she moved toward the door, a strange sound made her stop dead in her tracks. It was a ticking. At first, it was soft, barely noticeable. But as Sarah turned her head toward the sound, it grew louder, closer. The clock, the same one she had seen in Mr. Clayton's study earlier, was ticking. But it wasn't the usual rhythm of time. No, this was different. It was erratic, quick, as if the hands of the clock were racing against time itself. Click, tick, click. Her pulse quickened again, fear crawling back into her chest. She turned slowly, following the sound. And there, just beneath the cracked altar, the clock lay, ticking relentlessly as if calling her. But this time, something was different. The hands were spinning wildly, moving faster and faster. And as Sarah stepped closer, she saw the faintest glow coming from within the clock's mechanism. The creature's laughter echoed in her mind, filling her with dread. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.